This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. The Stranger by Catherine Mansfield. It seemed to the little crowd on the wharf that she was never going to move again. There she lay, immense, motionless on the grey crinkled water, a loop of smoke above her, an immense flock of gulls screaming and diving after the galley droppings at the stern. You could just see little couples parading, little flies walking up and down to the dish on the grey crinkled tablecloth. Other flies clustered and swarmed at the edge. Now there was a gleam of white on the lower deck, the cook's apron or the stewardess perhaps. Now a tiny black spider raced up the ladder onto the bridge. In the front of the crowd a strong-looking middle-aged man, dressed very well, very snugly in a grey overcoat, grey silk scarf, thick gloves and dark felt hat, marched up and down, twirling his folded umbrella. He seemed to be the leader of the little crowd on the wharf, and at the same time to keep them together. He was something between the sheepdog and the shepherd. But what a fool he had been not to bring any glasses. There wasn't a pair of glasses between the whole lot of them. Curious thing, Mr. Scott, that none of us thought of glasses. We might have been able to stir 'em up a bit. We might have managed a little signalling. Don't hesitate to land. Natives harmless. Or a welcome awaits you. All is forgiven. What, eh? Mr. Hammond's quick, eager glance, so nervous and yet so friendly and confiding, took in everybody on the wharf, roped in even those old chaps lounging against the gangways. They knew, every man jack of them, that Mrs. Hammond was on that boat, and that he was so tremendously excited it never entered his head not to believe that this marvellous fact meant something to them too. It warmed his heart towards them. They were, he decided, as decent a crowd of people, those old chaps over by the gangways, too. Fine, solid old chaps. What chests, by Jove! And he squared his own, plunged his thick gloved hands into his pockets, rocked from heel to toe. Yes, my wife's been in Europe for the last 10 months, on a visit to our eldest girl, who was married last year. I brought her up here, as far as Salisbury, myself, so I thought I'd better come and fetch her back. Yes, yes, yes. The shrewd grey eyes narrowed again and searched anxiously, quickly, the motionless liner. Again his overcoat was unbuttoned. Out came the thin, butter-yellow watch again, and for the 20th, 50th, 100th time he made the calculation. Let me see now. It was 2:15 when the doctor's launch went off. 2:15. It is now exactly 28 minutes past 4. That is to say, the doctor's been gone 2 hours and 13 minutes. 2 hours and 13 minutes. Wow! He gave a queer little half-whistle and snapped his watch to again. But I think we should have been told if there was anything up. Don't you, Mr. Gabbin? Oh yes, Mr. Hammond. I don't think there's anything to worry about, said Mr. Gabbin, knocking out his pipe against the heel of his shoe. At the same time, quite so, cried Mr. Hammond. Dashed annoying. He paced quickly up and down and came back again to his stand between Mr. and Mrs. Scott and Mr. Gabbin. It's getting quite dark, too, and he waved his folded umbrella as though the dusk at least might have had the decency to keep off for a bit. But the dusk came slowly, spreading like a slow stain over the water. Little Jean Scott dragged at her mother's hand. "I want my tea, Mummy," she wailed. "I expect you do," said Mr. Hammond. "I expect all these ladies want their tea." And his kind, flushed, almost pitiful glance roped them all in again. He wondered whether Janey was having a final cup of tea in the saloon out there. He hoped so. He thought not. It would be just like her not to leave the deck. In that case perhaps the deck steward would bring her up a cup. If he'd been there he'd have got it for her, somehow. And for a moment he was on deck, standing over her, watching her little hand fold round the cup in the way she had, while she drank the only cup of tea to be got on board. But now he was back here, and the Lord only knew when that cursed captain would stop hanging about in the stream. He took another turn, up and down, up and down. He walked as far as the cab stand to make sure his driver hadn't disappeared. Back he swerved again to the little flock huddled in the shelter of the banana crates. Little Jean Scott was still wanting her tea. Poor little beggar. He wished he had a bit of chocolate on him. "Here, Jean," he said, like a lift-up. And easily, gently, he swung the little girl onto a higher barrel. The movement of holding her, steadying her, relieved him wonderfully, lightened his heart. "Hold on," he said, keeping an arm round her. "Oh, don't worry about Jean, Mr. Hammond," said Mrs. Scott. "That's all right, Mrs. Scott. No trouble. It's a pleasure. Jean's a little pal of mine, aren't you, Jean?" "Yes, Mr. Hammond," said Jean, and she ran her finger down the dent of his felt hat. But suddenly she caught him by the ear and gave a loud scream. "Look, Mr. Hammond, she's moving. Look, she's coming in." By Jove, so she was, at last. She was slowly, slowly turning round. A bell sounded far over the water, and a great spout of steam gushed into the air. The gulls rose. They fluttered away like bits of white paper, and whether that deep throbbing was her engines or his heart Mr. Hammond couldn't say. He had to nerve himself to bear it, whatever it was. At that moment old Captain Johnson, the harbour master, came striding down the wharf, a leather portfolio under his arm. "Jean'll be all right," said Mr. Scott. "I'll hold her." He was just in time. Mr. Hammond had forgotten about Jean. He sprang away to greet old Captain Johnson. "Well, Captain," the eager nervous voice rang out again, "you've taken pity on us at last." "It's no good blaming me, Mr. Hammond," wheezed old Captain Johnson, staring at the liner. "You got Mrs. Hammond on board, ain't you?" "Yes, yes," said Hammond, and he kept by the harbour master's side. "Mrs. Hammond's there. Hello! We shan't be long now." With her telephone ringing, the thrum of her screw filling the air, the big liner bore down on them, cutting sharp through the dark water so that the big white shavings curled to either side. Hammond and the harbour master kept in front of the rest. Hammond took off his hat. He raked the decks. They were crammed with passengers. He waved his hat and bawled a loud, strange "Hello!" across the water, and then turned round and burst out laughing, and said something, nothing, to old Captain Johnson. "Seen her?" asked the harbour master. "No, not yet. Steady, wait a bit." And suddenly, between two great clumsy idiots, "Get out of the way there!" he signed with his umbrella. He saw a hand raised, a white glove shaking a handkerchief. Another moment, and thank God, there she was. There was Janey. There was Mrs. Hammond. Yes, 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 standing by the rail and smiling and nodding and waving her handkerchief. "Well, that's first class, first class. Well, well, well." He positively stamped. Like lightning he drew out his cigar case and offered it to old Captain Johnson. "Have a cigar, Captain. They're pretty good. Have a couple. Here." And he pressed all the cigars in the case on the harbour master. "I've a couple of boxes up at the hotel." "Thanks, Mr. Hammond," wheezed old Captain Johnson. Hammond stuffed the cigar case back. His hands were shaking, but he'd got hold of himself again. He was able to face Janey. There she was, leaning on the rail, talking to